The moment my father cleared his throat and looked at me with that thin, clinical smile, I understood that he hadn't invited me to the quarterly executive meeting to support me. He had invited me to measure me, and to break me if necessary. The conference room of Alden and Company smelled of polished oak and old money. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the skyline like a mirror of ambition. At the far end of the table sat the board, 7 men and women who had watched me grow up in these halls, who had seen me bring coffee to my father as a teenager, who had once patted my shoulder and called me the future. That morning, they watched me like a liability. I had spent 3 months preparing a restructuring proposal, data models, expansion forecasts, risk mitigation plans. I knew the numbers better than anyone in that room. I had memorized the margins, the hidden inefficiencies bleeding us dry, the divisions that survived only because they were my uncle's pride. But when my father began speaking, none of that mattered. He did not attack my analysis. He did not question my research. He questioned me. He spoke about temperament, about leadership requiring steel, about how markets punish hesitation, and how clients smell instability. His voice remained calm, almost paternal. Then he smiled at me and said I was brilliant, hardworking, yet too emotional to lead. The word hung in the air like perfume masking something rotten. Too emotional. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, some sympathetic, some relieved, a few curious, as if waiting to see whether I would prove his point by reacting. Heat rose behind my ribs. My pulse thundered in my ears. I imagined every late night, every negotiation I had handled quietly, every crisis I had absorbed without credit. I imagined standing up and listing them all. Instead, I folded my hands on the table. I did not defend myself. I did not cry. I did not flinch. I let him finish. The silence afterward was suffocating. My father leaned back, confident, certain the narrative had been set. The board murmured politely. The meeting moved on. But as I gathered my papers, I saw something flicker in the eyes of Mrs. Davenport, our oldest board member. Not doubt in me, doubt in him. The vote for the new CEO would take place in 1 week. And for the first time in my life, I understood that silence could be more powerful than any outburst. I left the building without looking back. By the time the elevator doors closed behind me that afternoon, the humiliation had already begun to settle into something heavier than anger. It was not the sharp sting of public criticism that hurt most. It was the familiarity of it. My father had been preparing that moment for years. I had grown up inside Alden and Company like a carefully managed investment. My childhood photos were framed in the hallway outside his office. Me in a Navy school uniform, me at a charity gala, me shaking hands with executives twice my age. I had been positioned as legacy long before I understood what inheritance truly meant. But legacy, I realized, was only valuable if it could be controlled. At home that evening, my mother pretended nothing unusual had happened. The dining room was lit by soft amber chandeliers, the silverware aligned with military precision. She spoke about an upcoming charity auction, about seating arrangements, about optics. She never mentioned the meeting. Her silence was different from mine. Mine was deliberate. Hers was survival. I noticed the way she avoided looking directly at me, as if acknowledging what had happened would force her to choose a side. My father, meanwhile, behaved with exaggerated warmth. He asked about my future plans, about whether I had considered leading one of the smaller regional branches first. His tone was kind, almost protective. The implication was clear. Step aside gracefully. That night, alone in my apartment across town, a space I had insisted on buying without family funds, I replayed the meeting in my mind. I slowed it down like film footage. The micro-expressions, the shifting posture of the board, the slight tightening of Mrs. Davenport's jaw when my father used the word emotional. He had expected me to react. He had needed me to react. Because if I had raised my voice, if my eyes had filled with tears, if I had defended myself too fiercely, he would have turned to the board and said nothing at all. He wouldn't have needed to. They would have seen what he wanted them to see. Instead, I had given them something else. Control. Over the next few days, I did not campaign loudly. I did not confront him. I scheduled quiet one-on-one meetings with each board member under the pretense of clarifying financial projections. I brought data, not feelings. Charts, not grievances. Risk assessments, not resentment. I let the numbers speak. And something subtle began to shift. Mr. Caldwell, who rarely deviated from my father's side, asked unusually pointed questions about declining overseas margins. Mrs. Davenport requested additional documentation on executive compensation. Even my uncle, whose division had been hemorrhaging funds for years, seemed uneasy. The company was not stable, and everyone knew it. By the end of the week, whispers had begun to circulate, not about my temperament but about sustainability. Still, the memory of that conference room lingered like a bruise. My father had not just questioned my leadership. He had questioned my identity in front of the only audience that mattered. In 3 days, the board would vote, and I could feel him preparing another move. What he didn't realize was that I had stopped trying to win his approval. I was preparing to win the room. 3 days before the vote, my father made his second move. It came wrapped in generosity. An internal memo was circulated early Monday morning announcing a strategic review presentation to be delivered by him at the end of the week. One final overview before the board cast their decision. Attached to the memo was a short note stating that I would also be given 10 minutes to briefly summarize my restructuring proposal. 10 minutes. After months of preparation, the message was clear. He would dominate the narrative, and I would be reduced to a footnote. When I read the memo on my laptop, seated at the small kitchen table in my apartment, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was almost mathematical. If he needed to compress me into 10 minutes, then he was no longer certain of control. That afternoon, I walked into the office earlier than usual. The marble floors echoed under my heels, the building still quiet. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see the long table where he had dismantled me the week before. I stood there for a moment, studying the space like an architect analyzing weak points in a structure. Then I began to rebuild my presentation. Not emotionally, not defensively, strategically. If I had only 10 minutes, then every second would carry weight. I removed anything ornamental. No storytelling, no personal commentary, no references to legacy. I stripped the proposal down to the essentials. Cash flow projections, comparative competitor growth, internal inefficiencies, and the single most dangerous truth. Our flagship division, overseen by my father, had underperformed for 6 consecutive quarters. The data had always been there, but no one had framed it plainly. As the week progressed, tension inside the company thickened. Employees sensed the impending shift. Assistants whispered in corridors. Even the cleaning staff moved more quietly around executive offices, as if the air itself were fragile. At home, my mother's anxiety became visible. She rearranged flowers that did not need rearranging. She adjusted the curtains 3 times in one evening. My father, meanwhile, grew increasingly attentive toward me. He sent articles about executive resilience. He invited me to lunch and spoke about family unity. He never apologized. He never mentioned the word emotional again. On Thursday night, I barely slept. Not because I feared losing, but because I realized something that unsettled me more than defeat. If I won, I would not just be challenging his authority. I would be dismantling the version of our family that had existed my entire life. The morning of the presentation arrived cold and bright. The boardroom lights reflected against the polished table like interrogation lamps. My father entered first, composed, charismatic, already owning the space. When my turn came, I rose without hesitation. 10 minutes, 7 board members, and a silence that felt very different from the one a week earlier. This time, it wasn't waiting for me to break. It was waiting for something to change. I did not begin with a defense of myself. I began with a graph. The first slide illuminated the screen behind me. 6 quarters of declining net profit in our flagship division. Clean lines. Unemotional numbers. No adjectives. No blame. Just evidence. I felt my father's gaze before I saw it. Heavy. Measuring. Expecting hesitation. There was none. I moved steadily through the data. My voice even, my posture relaxed. I showed comparative growth across competitors who had already pivoted to digital infrastructure, while we clung to legacy systems. I highlighted operational redundancies that drained capital quietly, but consistently. I outlined the projected risk exposure if no structural changes were made within 12 months. No theatrics. No references to that humiliating afternoon. Just clarity. By minute 4, the room had shifted. Chairs leaned forward instead of back. Pens began to move across paper. Mr. Caldwell, who rarely interrupted anyone, raised his hand, not to challenge, but to ask for elaboration on one of the risk models. I answered without consulting notes. At minute 7, I displayed the most delicate slide of all: executive allocation versus performance output. It was presented neutrally, almost clinically. The highest compensation in the company aligned with the lowest growth curve. The alignment was impossible to ignore. I did not say my father's name. I didn't need to. A subtle ripple passed around the table. Mrs. Davenport's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. My uncle shifted in his seat. My father remained still, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly around his pen. When my 10 minutes concluded, I simply said that sustainable leadership required not only vision, but accountability, across every level, including the top. Then I stepped back. The silence that followed was not suffocating like before. It was analytical. My father rose for his presentation immediately after. He spoke with the same commanding tone he had used for decades. He framed the declining numbers as temporary volatility. He emphasized brand loyalty, family legacy, market patience. He spoke of loyalty as though it were a business metric. But something had fractured. The board's questions were sharper now, less deferential. They asked about succession planning transparency. They asked about why restructuring proposals had been delayed. They asked about digital strategy timelines that had been postponed for years. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty flicker across my father's face. And then came the moment that changed everything. Mrs. Davenport, voice steady and unhurried, asked him whether his earlier comment about my emotional capacity reflected his professional assessment or a personal bias. The question hung like a blade. He attempted a measured response, but the authority behind his words felt thinner, defensive. And suddenly, I understood something I had never allowed myself to consider. My father hadn't humiliated me because I was weak. He had done it because he was afraid. The vote would take place the following morning. As we left the room, he did not look at me. But for the first time, I no longer felt like his daughter in that building. I felt like his competition. The morning of the vote arrived with an almost ceremonial stillness, as if the building itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen. I arrived early. The lobby lights cast pale reflections against the marble floors, and the company logo, our family name carved in brushed steel, gleamed above the reception desk. I had walked beneath that name my entire life, as a child holding my father's hand, as an intern carrying files, as an executive proving over and over that I belonged. Today, I walked beneath it knowing I might redefine it. The board gathered behind closed doors at 9 sharp. I was not permitted inside during deliberation. Neither was my father. We waited in separate offices on opposite sides of the same corridor. Like two generals confined before a verdict neither could influence anymore. From my office window, the city looked distant and indifferent. Traffic flowed. People hurried across intersections. The world continued without regard for family dynasties unraveling inside glass towers. I tried to steady my breathing. What surprised me most was not fear of losing. It was grief. Because winning would not feel triumphant. It would feel final. Memories surfaced uninvited. The first time my father brought me into the boardroom as a teenager, telling me to observe how leaders command space. The pride in his eyes when I graduated at the top of my class. The way he once told a colleague that I had his mind. At some point, that pride had turned into rivalry. A knock on my door pulled me back. The assistant's face was neutral, carefully trained. The board was ready. When I entered the conference room, the air felt different from the previous meetings. Not tense. Not anticipatory. Resolved. My father sat at the far end of the table. His expression was composed, but something in his posture had softened. Not defeated, not yet, but aware. Mrs. Davenport held a single sheet of paper. She did not prolong the moment. 7 votes had been cast. 7 in favor of appointing a new chief executive officer. 7 in favor of me. The number echoed inside my chest louder than applause ever could. It wasn't just a majority. It was unanimous. 7-0. For a brief second, I felt weightless. Then reality descended with quiet gravity. The board members congratulated me with restrained professionalism. Hands were shaken. Formalities observed. Transition timelines discussed. My father remained seated. He did not object. He did not argue. He did not look betrayed. He looked older. When our eyes finally met across the table, there was no anger in his. Only something more complex, recognition. As if he were seeing, for the first time, not his daughter seeking approval, but a leader who no longer needed it. I realized then that the humiliation a week ago had not been a mistake. It had been his last attempt to hold control. And my silence had been the beginning of its end. As the meeting adjourned, I stood at the head of the table. The position he had occupied for decades. The title was mine. But the cost was still unfolding. The first week as CEO did not feel victorious. It felt surgical. Announcements were drafted. Press releases approved. The market responded cautiously but positively. Internally, the shift moved like a quiet earthquake. No dramatic collapse. Just a recalibration of power that everyone could feel beneath their feet. My father remained in the building for the transition period. He walked the same corridors, entered the same elevator, attended scheduled handover meetings with measured professionalism. To the outside world, it appeared dignified. But in private moments, when our paths crossed in silence, I sensed the fracture between us widening into something neither of us knew how to bridge. I did not fire him. I did not sideline him publicly. Instead, I reassigned him to a strategic advisory role with limited operational authority. An honorable exit disguised as continuity. The board approved unanimously. It was clean, respectful. I refused to replicate the humiliation he had given me. Yet leadership demanded more than restraint. Within days, I initiated the restructuring plan exactly as presented. The underperforming division was audited. Compensation structures were revised to reflect measurable outcomes. Digital investments were accelerated. Several long-protected executives were asked to justify their positions with data, not loyalty. There was resistance, of course. Whispers about generational shifts. Subtle accusations that I was moving too quickly, too coldly, too emotional. The irony did not escape me. One evening, as I remained alone in the boardroom reviewing quarterly projections, I caught my reflection in the glass wall overlooking the city. For a moment, I saw not myself, but my father at my age. The same intensity, the same hunger to protect what he believed was his life's work. And that was the final realization. His humiliation of me had never been about my weakness. It had been about his fear of becoming irrelevant. The story that had framed me as too emotional to lead was never about capability. It was about succession. I understood now that leadership is not the absence of emotion. It is the mastery of it. The ability to feel pressure without surrendering to it. To absorb public doubt without internalizing it. To remain composed when your identity is challenged in front of witnesses. A week earlier, I had sat in that same room and chosen silence over reaction. That silence had unsettled him, but it had convinced them. Months later, the company's growth stabilized. Investor confidence strengthened. The narrative outside shifted from controversial succession to strategic evolution. At a formal gala celebrating the company's anniversary, I stood at the podium where my father had once spoken countless times. The room shimmered with chandeliers and familiar faces. He sat in the front row. When I thanked the previous leadership for building the foundation we now stood on, our eyes met briefly. There was no applause loud enough to fill what had changed between us, but there was acknowledgement. Not of defeat, of transition. They had once said I was too emotional to lead, but when the board voted 7-0, it wasn't because I suppressed who I was. It was because I finally understood that control is quiet, and power does not need to shout.